floating on a raft miles from the cruise ship. The gentle rocking became a violent shake, pitched into the water, disoriented and afraid. A massive shape glided silently from below. Jaws opened wide, revealing a pink cavern of doom. In seconds, the raft was empty, bobbing alone on the waves. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we begin the ORCA ATTACK story, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to the channel. Your subscription is very important to us, so please subscribe, click the like button, and leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. Now let's move on to the case. Jack Thornton stood on the pebbled shore of a secluded Alaskan beach, his weathered hands methodically checking the straps on his bright orange kayak. The crisp morning air nipped at his exposed skin, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of the last frontier. At 45, Jack was no stranger to these waters. He'd been kayaking since he was a teenager, but the Alaskan coastline always demanded respect. "All right, old girl," he muttered to his kayak, patting its sturdy hull. "Let's hope for calm seas and curious seals, eh?" He reached into the pocket of his Gore-Tex jacket, pulling out a folded map and a small notebook. Flipping it open, Jack reviewed his meticulously planned route one last time. His finger traced the jagged coastline, lingering on the areas marked with recent marine life sightings. "Humpbacks near Aukie Bay," he read aloud, his voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves. "Sea lions at Benjamin Island and orcas spotted off Point Retreat." Jack's brow furrowed slightly at the last notation. Orcas were magnificent creatures, but their presence always added an element of unpredictability to any excursion. He'd had a few distant encounters with them, over the years always maintaining a respectful distance. Still, a tingle of excitement mixed with apprehension ran down his spine. Shaking off the feeling, Jack tucked the map and notebook away and began his final gear check. He patted the pocket containing his emergency beacon and checked that his marine radio was securely fastened to his life vest. The satellite phone was safely stowed in a waterproof container within easy reach. Better to have it and not need it, he reminded himself, thinking of the countless safety lectures he'd given to novice kayakers over the years. As Jack worked, the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water. The scenery was breathtaking. Rugged, snow-capped mountains reflected in the glassy surface of the sea, while dense forests of spruce and hemlock clung to the rocky shoreline. It was moments like these that kept Jack coming back, despite the risks. With everything secured, Jack took a deep breath, savoring the salty air and the faint scent of pine carried on the breeze. He closed his eyes for a moment, centering himself and focusing on the task ahead. "Okay, Jack," he said aloud, his voice firm with resolve. "Time to push off. Stay alert. Stay safe." With practiced ease, Jack pushed his kayak into the water and gracefully slid into the cockpit. The familiar feeling of the paddle in his hands brought a smile to his face as he began to cut through the calm waters. For the first few hours, Jack maintained a steady pace, his muscles working in perfect harmony with the rhythm of the sea. He passed by small, uninhabited islands, marveling at the diverse wildlife. Sea otters floated lazily on their backs, while bald eagles soared overhead, their keen eyes searching for fish. As midday approached, Jack paused to consult his map and have a quick snack. He was making good time, the weather conditions were ideal, and he'd even spotted a few humpback whales breaching in the distance. Everything was going according to plan. "Can't ask for a better day than this," he said to himself, taking a swig of water from his hydration pack. Just then, a splash in the distance caught his attention. Jack squinted, trying to make out the source. His heart rate quickened as he spotted a group of sleek, dark shapes gliding through the water about half a mile away. "Orcas," he breathed, a mix of awe and caution in his voice. Jack knew the protocol: maintain distance, avoid interfering with their natural behaviors, and under no circumstances try to approach them. He watched as the pod, consisting of what looked like 5 or 6 individuals, moved gracefully through the water. Their tall, distinctive dorsal fins cut through the surface like black sails. For a moment, Jack was transfixed by the sight. It was rare to see orcas this close, and he couldn't help but feel privileged. However, his years of experience quickly kicked in, reminding him of the potential danger. "Time to give you folks a wide berth," he murmured, adjusting his course to steer clear of the orca's path. As Jack paddled, keeping a watchful eye on the pod, he noticed something else. A group of seals lounging on some rocks near the shore. His experienced eye immediately recognized the situation. The orcas were likely on a hunt, and those seals were potential prey. "Oh boy," Jack muttered, realizing he was inadvertently positioned between predator and prey. This could get interesting. He increased his pace, aiming to quickly remove himself from the area. The last thing he wanted was to be caught in the middle of an orca hunt. As he paddled, Jack kept glancing back at the pod, noting with growing concern that they seemed to be moving in his general direction. "It's fine," he reassured himself. "They're not interested in you. Just keep moving." But as the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent towards the horizon, Jack couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. The orcas, while not actively pursuing him, seemed to be shadowing his movements. Every time he looked back, they were there, their fins slicing through the water with effortless power. As dusk approached, Jack knew he needed to find a place to make camp for the night. He scanned the shoreline, looking for a suitable spot to land. His eyes settled on a small rocky island not far ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. With a sense of relief, Jack steered his kayak towards the island. As he approached the shore, he cast one last glance behind him. The orcas were still visible, but they seemed to be moving away, their fins disappearing beneath the waves. Jack let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "That's right, go on about your business," he said, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. As his kayak ground against the pebbly shore of the small island, Jack felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease. He climbed out, stretching his legs and taking in his surroundings. The island was little more than a rocky outcropping, with a few stunted trees clinging stubbornly to life in the harsh coastal environment. Jack efficiently set about making camp, his movements automatic after years of practice. He secured his kayak well above the tide line, set up his small tent, and prepared a simple meal on his portable stove. As night fell, Jack sat on a flat rock watching the last rays of sunlight paint the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink. The beauty of the scene was breathtaking, but he couldn't fully shake the unease that had settled over him during the day's paddle. "You're being paranoid, old man," he chided himself. "Those orcas weren't interested in you. Tomorrow's another day." But as Jack crawled into his tent that night, zipping up his sleeping bag against the chill, he couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore, usually a soothing lullaby, now seemed ominous in the darkness. Just before drifting off to sleep, Jack's last thoughts were of the orcas. In his mind's eye, he saw their sleek black bodies gliding through the water, powerful and purposeful. Little did he know that this image would pale in comparison to what awaited him in the coming days. As sleep finally claimed him, the Alaskan wilderness fell silent, save for the distant calls of nocturnal animals and the ever-present whisper of the sea. On the horizon, barely visible in the fading light, a large dorsal fin broke the surface of the water before silently slipping back into the depths. The pre-dawn chill seeped through Jack's tent, rousing him from a fitful sleep. His dreams had been haunted by dark shapes moving beneath the waves, their presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. As consciousness fully returned, Jack shook his head, trying to dispel the lingering unease. "Get a grip, Thornton," he muttered to himself, his breath visible in the cool air. "You've got a long day ahead." Jack unzipped his sleeping bag and emerged from the tent, shivering slightly as the crisp Alaskan air hit his skin. The sky was a palette of muted grays and blues, the sun not yet breaching the horizon. A thick fog had rolled in overnight, shrouding the small island and the surrounding waters in an eerie mist. As he began breaking down his camp, Jack's mind wandered to the orcas he'd seen the previous day. Part of him hoped they'd moved on, while another part, the part that had always been drawn to the raw power of nature, secretly wished for another glimpse. With his gear packed and his kayak ready to launch, Jack paused at the water's edge. The fog limited visibility to barely 50 yards in any direction. He pulled out his marine radio, checking the weather report one last time. A crackle of static, then a monotone voice. "Marine forecast for Juneau and surrounding waters. Dense fog expected to persist through mid-morning. Visibility less than 1 nautical mile in most areas. Small craft advisory in effect. Jack weighed his options. The responsible choice would be to wait for the fog to lift. But he was already behind schedule, and the weather could turn at any moment in these parts. Visibility will improve, he reasoned aloud. I know these waters. I'll just take it slow. Decision made, Jack pushed his kayak into the water and climbed in. The fog seemed to swallow him whole as he paddled away from the island, the shoreline quickly disappearing from view. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against his hull and the rhythmic dip of his paddle. For the first hour, Jack navigated purely by compass and his intimate knowledge of the coastline. The fog showed no signs of lifting, creating a disorienting bubble around him. Occasionally, he'd hear the distant bark of a sea lion or the haunting call of a loon, the sounds distorted by the mist. As the hidden sun climbed higher, Jack began to notice subtle changes in the water's behavior. Small, concentric ripples appeared around his kayak as if something large was moving beneath the surface. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down his spine. It's just the current, he said aloud, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the fog. But even as he spoke, Jack knew he was lying to himself. These waters were familiar to him, and this wasn't normal current behavior. Suddenly, a massive splash erupted from the water no more than 20 yards ahead. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as a large, dark shape breached the surface before disappearing back into the depths. The fog made it impossible to identify, but the size alone narrowed down the possibilities. Whale, Jack whispered, his knuckles white on the paddle. Has to be a humpback. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The shape had been too sleek, too predatory to be a humpback. As if to confirm his fears, a tall, straight dorsal fin sliced through the water off to his right, easily 5 feet high. Orca. Jack breathed, a mixture of awe and fear in his voice. The fin disappeared, and for a moment all was quiet. Then, barely audible at first but growing louder, came a series of clicks and whistles. The vocalization seemed to come from all around him, amplified and distorted by the fog. Jack's mind raced. He knew orcas were highly intelligent and social, creatures known for their complex vocalizations, but he'd never heard anything quite like this. It was as if they were communicating about him. Easy, big fellas, Jack said, trying to keep his voice calm despite his racing heart. I'm just passing through, no need to. His words were cut short as something solid bumped against the bottom of his kayak. Jack yelped, nearly losing his grip on the paddle. The bump came again, harder this time, nearly capsizing the small craft. Hey! Jack shouted, a note of panic creeping into his voice. Cut it out! As if in response, a large male orca suddenly surfaced right next to Jack's. Its massive body dwarfed Jack's vessel, the creature's distinctive black and white coloration a stark contrast to the gray fog. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack found himself staring directly into the orca's eye. An intelligent, almost curious, gaze that seemed to pierce right through him. Oh my God, Jack whispered, frozen in place. The orca submerged again, but Jack could see its massive shape gliding beneath his kayak. He knew he needed to move, to get out of there, but fear had temporarily paralyzed him. It wasn't until he felt another bump from below that his survival instincts kicked in. With adrenaline surging through his veins, Jack began paddling furiously. He no longer cared about maintaining his planned route. His only goal was to put as much distance between himself and the orcas as possible. But the fog made navigation nearly impossible, and Jack quickly realized he had no idea which direction he was heading. The sounds of the orcas followed him, their clicks and whistles now taking on a more urgent, almost excited tone. Jack's arms burned with exertion as he pushed himself harder than he ever had before. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool air, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Just as Jack thought he might have outpaced the pod, a massive form breached the water directly in front of him. The orca, possibly the same large male he'd seen earlier, hung in the air for a split second before crashing back down, sending a wave that nearly capsized Jack's kayak. Jesus Christ! Jack yelled, struggling to maintain his balance. As he steadied himself, Jack noticed a break in the fog ahead. A rocky outcropping loomed out of the mist, its jagged edges offering both hope and danger. If he could reach those rocks, He might be able to get out of the water and to safety, but navigating through them in this fog with orcas on his tail would be incredibly risky. Jack made a split-second decision. "Come on, old girl," he said to his kayak, angling towards the rocks. "Don't fail me now." The next few minutes were a blur of frantic paddling and hairpin turns. Jack weaved through the rock formations, the scrape of stone against his hull a constant reminder of how little room for error he had. The orca's vocalizations grew more distant, the larger animals unable to follow him through the narrow passages. Just when Jack thought he might make it, a dark shape loomed out of the fog directly in his path. He tried to turn, but it was too late. His kayak slammed into the rock, the impact nearly throwing him into the frigid water. As Jack struggled to right himself, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold, the hiss of air escaping from his kayak's ruptured hull. "No, no, no," Jack muttered, desperately trying to assess the damage. But even as he looked, he could feel the kayak settling lower in the water. The sound of powerful flukes slapping the water echoed through the fog. The orcas were still out, there, waiting. Jack knew he had only moments to make a decision. The rocky outcropping was only a few yards away now, offering his only chance of survival. With no other choice, Jack slipped out of his sinking kayak and into the bone-chilling water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, nearly driving the air from his lungs. But survival instinct took over and Jack began swimming towards the rocks with powerful strokes. As his hands finally grasped the rough stone, Jack allowed himself a moment of hope. He began to pull himself up, his waterlogged clothes making the climb difficult. But just as he thought he might be safe, a large dark shape glided past in his peripheral vision. Jack froze, clinging to the rock as he watched the massive dorsal fin of the male orca cut through the water barely 10 feet away. The animal moved with deliberate slowness as if aware of Jack's vulnerable position. As it passed, it turned slightly, its eye once again meeting Jack's gaze. In that moment, as man and predator locked eyes, Jack felt a primal fear unlike anything he'd ever experienced. This was nature at its most raw and unforgiving, and he was no longer at the top of the food chain. As the orca disappeared back into the fog, its haunting vocalizations lingering in the air, Jack realized that his adventure had turned into a fight for survival. And it was far from over. Jack clung to the slippery rock, his body shivering uncontrollably from both the frigid Alaskan waters and the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The dense fog continued to swirl around him, limiting his visibility to mere yards in any direction. The eerie silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the rocks and his own ragged breathing. "Think, Jack, think," he muttered, to himself, teeth chattering. He needed to assess his situation and form a plan, but the immediacy of the danger made it hard to focus. Suddenly, a low, resonant vocalization echoed through the mist, sending a fresh wave of fear through Jack's body. The orcas were still out there, circling, waiting. He could sense their presence even if he couldn't see them. Jack cautiously pulled himself higher onto the rock, wincing as the rough surface scraped against his palms. He needed to get out of the water completely. Being half submerged made him too vulnerable. As he moved, he felt the weight of his waterlogged clothes dragging him down. His fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the zipper of his jacket. Come on," he hissed in frustration. Finally, the zipper gave way, and Jack shrugged off the heavy garment, letting it fall into the water below. He did the same, with his outer layer of pants leaving him in his thermal underlayers. It wasn't much, but it allowed him more freedom of movement. Just as Jack was about to pull himself fully onto the rock, a massive form glided past, so close he could have, reached out and touched it. The orca's sleek black skin glistened with water droplets, its white patches stark against the gloomy backdrop. Jack held his breath, not daring to move a muscle. The orca circled back, moving with deliberate slowness. Its dorsal fin, easily 6 feet tall, cut through the water like a knife. As it passed, its eye rolled to the side, fixing Jack with an intelligent, almost curious gaze. Jack felt like prey being sized up by a predator, which he realized with a jolt of terror was exactly what was happening. "Easy, big fella," Jack whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not on the menu, just passing through." As if in response, the orca suddenly dove, disappearing beneath the surface. The water went still, an unnatural calm settling over the area. Jack's eyes darted back and forth, trying to gauge where the creature might resurface. The silence stretched on, each second feeling like an eternity. Then, without warning, the orca burst from the water mere feet from where Jack clung to the rock. Its massive body hung in the air for a split second, water cascading off its form before crashing back down with tremendous force. The impact sent a wave surging towards Jack, nearly dislodging him from his precarious perch. "Jesus!" Jack yelled, scrambling to maintain his grip on the slick rock. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound of rushing blood filling his ears. As Jack regained his balance, he realized with horror that his position had shifted. He was now further out on the rock, more exposed, and the orcas seemed to have noticed. Two more fins appeared, cutting through the fog to join the first. Jack could hear their clicks and whistles intensifying, almost as if they were communicating about him. He knew orcas were highly intelligent, capable of complex social behaviors and hunting strategies. Right now, that knowledge was far from comforting. "Okay, Jack," he said to himself, trying to keep his voice steady. "You need to move. Now." With painstaking slowness, Jack began to inch his way along the rock, aiming for a higher point where he might be out of the orca's reach. Every movement was cautious, calculated. One slip could send him plunging back into the water. And certain. Doom. He had made it about halfway to his goal when he heard it. A sound that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable rush of water being displaced by a large, fast-moving object. And it was coming straight for him. Jack barely had time to brace himself before the impact came. The orca slammed into the rock just below his feet, its powerful body sending shockwaves through the stone. Jack lost his grip, his body sliding down the slick surface towards the waiting jaws below. In a moment of pure instinct, Jack's hand shot out, grasping a small outcropping of rock. Pain lanced through his arm as his full weight yanked on the joint, but he held on, his feet dangling mere inches above the water. The orca circled back, its massive form a dark shadow beneath the surface. Jack could see its white patches moving, realigning as it prepared for another pass. He knew he couldn't withstand another hit. With a surge of desperate strength, Jack pulled himself up, ignoring the screaming protest of his muscles. He scrambled higher on the rock, his fingers finding purchase on tiny crevices, his feet pushing against any surface they could find. Just as he hauled himself onto a small ledge, he felt a rush of water behind him. The orca breached again, its jaws snapping shut on empty air where Jack's legs had been moments before. The creature's frustrated vocalization echoed off the rocks, a chilling sound that Jack felt in his very bones. Panting heavily, Jack pressed himself against the rock face. He was higher now, but far from safe. The ledge he was on was barely wide enough for him to maintain his balance, and the fog made it impossible to see if there was any better shelter nearby. As Jack caught his breath, he became acutely aware of a warm trickle down his arm. Looking down, he saw that his desperate climb had left his hands and forearms scraped and bleeding. The sight of blood dripping into the water below filled him with a new wave of dread. "No, no, no," he muttered, pressing his arms against his body to try and staunch the flow. But he knew it was too late. The damage was done. The orca's behavior changed almost immediately. Their vocalizations took on a more excited tone, their movements becoming more frenzied. Jack watched in horror as they began to circle tighter, their dorsal fins slicing through the water with increased speed. One of the orcas, the large male that had first approached Jack, suddenly dove deep. Jack lost sight of it for a moment, then gasped as he saw its white underside appear below him, the orca swimming on its back. Jack had heard of this behavior before. It was a hunting technique orcas used to spot seals on ice floes. The white of their undersides blended with the light filtering through the water, making them harder for prey to see. The fact that they were employing this tactic now meant one thing. They no longer saw Jack as a curiosity. He was prey. The realization hit Jack like a physical blow. This was no longer about getting back to his kayak or continuing his journey. This was about survival in its most primal form. As if to drive this point home, the male orca suddenly surged upward, its massive body rocketing out of the water. Jack pressed himself flat against the rock as the creature's jaws snapped shut just feet from his position. The power behind the move was terrifying. Jack could feel the displacement of air as the orca passed. The orca fell back into the water, with a tremendous splash, sending a wave crashing over Jack. For a moment he lost his footing on the narrow ledge, his body teetering on the edge of falling. With a desperate lunge, he managed to grab onto a protruding rock, steadying himself. But even as he regained his balance, Jack knew he was in an impossible situation. The ledge was too narrow to be a long-term sanctuary, and the orcas showed no signs of losing interest. If anything, their attacks were becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. As Jack watched the orcas regroup, preparing for another assault, a grim realization settled over him. The calm waters and beautiful scenery that had drawn him to this solo expedition now seemed like a cruel joke. Nature, in all its raw power and indifference, had reminded him of his place in the grand scheme of things. Jack Thornton, experienced kayaker and outdoor enthusiast, was no longer a visitor enjoying the Alaskan wilderness. He was fighting for his life against one of the ocean's apex predators, and as the largest orca began another powerful approach, its intentions clear in every streamlined movement, Jack knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The fog continued to swirl around him, the rocky outcropping his only refuge, in a suddenly hostile world. The sound of powerful flukes slapping the water echoed ominously, a countdown to the next attack. Jack closed his eyes for a brief moment, gathering every ounce of strength and resolve he had left. When he opened them again, they burned with determination. "All right," he said, his voice low and steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Let's dance." The orca's massive body erupted from the water, jaws agape, aiming directly for Jack's precarious perch. In that split second, time seemed to slow. Jack could see every detail. The orca's gleaming teeth, its intelligent eye fixed on him. Water droplets suspended in the air around its sleek form. "Move!" Jack's instinct screamed, overriding his paralyzed muscles. With a desperate lunge, he threw himself sideways, feeling the rush of displaced air as the orca's jaws snapped shut mere inches from where he had been. Jack hit the frigid water hard, the shock of cold stealing his breath. Underwater, the world became a confusing blur of bubbles and shadowy shapes. Jack kicked hard, fighting to reach the surface. His lungs burned, demanding air, just as his head broke the water, allowing him to gulp in a precious breath. He felt something solid brush against his leg. "No, no, no!" he gasped, panic rising in his throat. Jack's eyes darted around, trying to locate the rocks he had just left. The fog made it nearly impossible to orient himself. Somewhere to his left, he heard the distinctive exhalation of an orca surfacing. Without thinking, Jack dove, pushing himself deeper into the murky water. His eyes stung as he forced them open, searching for any sign of the approaching predators. A large, dark shape glided past, so close he could have reached out and touched it. Jack's heart hammered in his chest as he watched the orca circle back. He knew he couldn't stay underwater much longer. His lungs were already screaming for air. With no other choice, he kicked hard, aiming for the surface. As his head broke the water, Jack gasped, drawing in deep lungfuls of the crisp Alaskan air. The fog had thinned slightly, allowing him to spot a cluster of rocks about 20 yards away. It was his only chance. Jack began to swim, his strokes powerful and desperate. Behind him, he could hear the orca's vocalizations growing louder, more excited. They were in pursuit. "Come on, come on," Jack muttered through gritted teeth, pushing his body to its limits. He was halfway to the rocks when he felt it. A sudden pull on his leg, dragging him under. Jack thrashed wildly, his foot connecting with something solid. The grip loosened, allowing him to surface once more. Sputtering and coughing, Jack resumed his frantic swim. The rocks were so close now, tantalizingly within reach. But the orcas were closing in. He could sense their massive bodies moving beneath him, coordinating their attack. With a final desperate surge of energy, Jack lunged forward. His hands scraped against rough stone as he pulled himself onto the lowest part of the rocky outcropping. For a moment he lay there, chest heaving, relief washing over him. But the reprieve was short-lived. A powerful impact rocked the small island of stone, nearly dislodging Jack from his tenuous position. He scrambled higher, ignoring the pain. as sharp edges cut into his palms and knees. From his slightly elevated position, Jack finally had a clear view of his attackers. 3 orcas circled the rocks, their dorsal fins slicing through the water with ominous purpose. The largest, the male that had first approached his kayak, let out a haunting vocalization that sent shivers down Jack's spine. "What do you want? From me?" Jack shouted, his voice hoarse and breaking. "I'm not your damn prey." As if in response, the male orca suddenly dove. Jack watched, heart in his throat, as the water around the rocks began to churn. He braced himself, expecting another impact. Instead, the orca exploded from the water on the far side of the rocky outcropping, its entire body clearing the surface in a spectacular breach. For a moment, it hung in the air, water cascading off its massive form, before crashing back down with a thunderous splash. The display of raw power left Jack awestruck and terrified. He had always respected orcas, admired their intelligence and social complexity. But now, faced with their hunting prowess, he felt a primal fear unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Okay, think," Jack muttered to himself, trying to push past the panic clouding his mind. "You're out of the water. That's step 1. Now what?" He patted his pockets, hoping against hope that his satellite phone had somehow survived the ordeal. His heart sank as he felt nothing but soggy fabric. The phone, along with most of his emergency gear, was likely at the bottom of the sea with his kayak. A sharp pain in his leg drew Jack's attention. Looking down, he saw a series of deep gashes running along his calf, evidence of how close the orcas had come to dragging him under. The sight of his own blood trickling down into the water renewed his sense of urgency. "Got to stop the bleeding," he said through clenched teeth. Jack quickly stripped off his thermal shirt, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through his battered body. With shaking hands, he tore the fabric into strips, using them to bind his wounded leg as best he could. As he worked, Jack kept a wary eye on the circling orcas. Their behavior had changed subtly. Instead of the frenzied attacks of before, they now moved with a calculated patience. It was as if they knew they had him cornered and were content to wait him out. "You're smarter than I gave you credit for," Jack murmured, a grudging respect in his voice despite his dire situation. The fog was beginning to lift, burned away by the strengthening sun. Under different circumstances, Jack would have welcomed the improved visibility. Now it only served to highlight the vastness of the ocean surrounding his tiny refuge. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Jack's body trembled from cold and exhaustion. Dehydration was becoming a serious concern, his throat parched, and his lips cracking. But every time he considered trying to scoop up some seawater, the orca's presence reminded him of the danger that lurked just feet away. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack found himself talking to his pursuers. Maybe it was the delirium setting in, or just a desperate need to break the oppressive silence. "You know I've always admired your kind," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Watched every documentary I could find. Knew all about your hunting techniques, your social structures, but I never imagined I'd be on the receiving end." One of the smaller orcas, possibly a juvenile, approached the rocks, its head lifting, slightly out of the water as if curious about the strange creature addressing them. "That's right, I'm talking to you," Jack continued, a bitter laugh escaping his cracked lips. "Bet you've never had prey try to strike up a conversation before, huh?" The orca tilted its head, its eye fixed on Jack with an intelligence that was both fascinating and terrifying. For a moment, predator and prey regarded each other in silence. Then, without warning, the large male surged forward, its powerful body slamming into the rocks with bone-jarring force. Jack cried out as he was thrown backward, nearly sliding off his precarious perch and into the waiting jaws below. Okay, I get it," Jack shouted, scrambling to regain his position. "No more small talk." As night fell, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold, Jack found himself facing a grim reality. He was stranded on a tiny island of stone, surrounded by patient predators with no means of calling for help. His body was reaching its limits, battered by the elements and his earlier struggles. In the darkness, the orca's presence became even more unnerving. Jack could hear them surfacing to breathe, their exhalations a constant reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond his sight. Occasionally, he would catch a glimpse of their white patches glowing eerily in the moonlight as they passed. "Stay awake," Jack muttered to himself, pinching his arm hard. "You fall asleep, you fall in, stay awake." But exhaustion was taking its toll. Jack's eyelids felt like lead, his body swaying dangerously as he fought against the urge to sleep. In his semi-conscious state, memories began to blur with reality. He saw himself back on the beach where he had started this ill-fated journey, heard the phantom voice of a fellow kayaker warning him about recent orca sightings. In his mind, Jack screamed at his past self to listen, to turn back, but the apparition simply smiled and pushed off into the fog. A particularly loud exhalation from one of the orcas snapped Jack back to full awareness. He realized with horror that he had been mere seconds away from toppling into the water. "No," he growled, angry at his own weakness. "I'm not dying here. Not like this." With trembling hands, Jack began to massage feeling back into his numbed limbs. He knew that if he was going to survive, he needed to stay alert, to be ready for any opportunity to escape or signal for help. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Jack Thornton steeled himself for another day of this deadly standoff. The orcas still circled, their patience seemingly infinite, but a new determination had taken root in Jack's heart. He would survive this. He had to. And as the sun rose on another day in the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness, the battle between man and nature's most intelligent predator entered its next grueling phase. The rising sun painted the Alaskan sky in hues of pink and gold, a breathtaking display that Jack Thornton might have appreciated under different circumstances. Instead, he clung to his rocky refuge, his body racked with shivers, eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night of constant vigilance. "Another day in paradise," Jack muttered through chattering teeth, his attempted humor falling flat in the face of his dire situation. The orcas were still there, their tall dorsal fins cutting through the water as they patrolled around the small cluster of rocks. Throughout the night, Jack had heard their haunting vocalizations, a symphony of clicks, whistles, and haunting calls that seemed to penetrate his very bones. As the fog began to lift, Jack forced his stiff muscles to move, slowly stretching out his limbs. Every movement sent jolts of pain through his battered body. He winced as he examined the makeshift bandage on his leg, now stiff with dried blood. "Okay, Jack," he said to himself, his voice hoarse from thirst. "Assess the situation. What are your assets?" He patted down his pockets, hoping against hope that he might have overlooked something useful. His fingers brushed against a small, waterproof container in his back pocket. With trembling hands, he pulled it out. "Thank God," he breathed. Inside the container was a small emergency kit, a few waterproof matches, a tiny compass, and a small signal mirror. It wasn't much, but it was something. A loud exhalation from one of the orcas drew Jack's attention back to the water. The large male that had led the initial attack was circling closer, its massive body gliding effortlessly through the waves. "Still here, huh?" Jack called out, a hint of hysterical laughter in his voice. "Don't you have some seals to chase, or something?" The orca responded with a series of clicks, almost as if it were answering him. Then, without warning, it dove deep, disappearing from view. Jack tensed, his eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. He'd seen enough nature documentaries to know that orcas were capable of coordinated hunting strategies. The disappearance of the lead orca could signal the start of another attack. Seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system once again. Then, with a massive surge of water, the orca breached, its entire body clearing the surface mere feet from Jack's position. "Jesus," Jack cried out, scrambling backward as the orca crashed back into the sea, sending a wave of icy water washing over the rocks. As Jack wiped the salt water from his eyes, he noticed something floating in the water nearby. His heart leapt as he recognized a piece of his destroyed kayak. "My gear," he whispered, hope flickering to life in his chest. Without thinking, Jack began to edge towards the water, his eyes fixed on the floating debris. If he could just reach it, there might be something useful. His emergency radio, his flares, anything that could signal for help. He was so focused on the floating gear that he almost missed the dark shape gliding towards him underwater. At the last second, Jack threw himself backward, feeling the rush of displaced water as another orca shot past, jaws snapping shut on empty air. "Nice try," Jack gasped, his heart racing. "But I'm not that desperate." Yet, as if frustrated by their failed attempt, the orcas began a series of coordinated attacks on Jack's rocky refuge. They slammed their bodies against the stone, each impact sending shockwaves through the small island. Jack could only hold on, praying that the rocks would withstand the assault. Hours passed, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The orcas' attacks came in waves, periods of intense activity followed by eerie calm. Jack's throat burned with thirst, his lips cracked and bleeding. He knew that dehydration would soon become as big a threat as the predators circling below. During one of the lulls in the orcas' assault, Jack noticed a change in their behavior. They seemed more agitated, their vocalizations taking on a different tone. Then he heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping sound coming from somewhere beyond the fog. A boat, Jack realized, hope surging through him. "Hey, over here," he shouted, his voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. But the sound of the boat's engine faded away, never coming close enough to spot Jack's tiny island. As silence fell once again, broken only by the lapping of waves and the occasional exhalation from the orcas, Jack felt despair wash over him. "No one's coming," he said quietly, the reality of his situation sinking in. "I'm on my own." As the day wore on, Jack's condition deteriorated. The combination of exposure, dehydration, and exhaustion was taking its toll. His thoughts became sluggish and he found himself drifting in and out of consciousness. In his more lucid moments, Jack tried to form a plan. He knew he couldn't stay on the rocks indefinitely. Sooner or later he would succumb to the elements, or simply lose his grip and fall into the waiting jaws below. "Think, damn it," he muttered, pressing his palms against his temples. "There has to be a way out of this." As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Jack made a decision. He would wait for nightfall and then attempt to swim for it. It was a desperate plan, likely to end in failure, but it was better than simply waiting to die on the rocks. "You hear that?" he called out to the circling orcas, a hint of defiance in his voice. "I'm not giving up. Not yet." As if in response, the large male orca surfaced nearby, its blowhole expelling a cloud of mist. For a moment, predator and prey locked eyes. Jack found himself marveling at the intelligence he saw in that gaze, a grudging respect forming despite his fear. "You're persistent, I'll give you that," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But so am I." The orca dove, its massive tail fluke slapping the water's surface in a display that sent spray washing over Jack. He wiped the salt water from his face, a grim smile forming on his cracked lips. "Show off," he muttered. As darkness fell, Jack prepared himself for his desperate gambit. He knew the odds were stacked heavily against him. The orcas had the advantage of being in their element, able to see and navigate in the dark waters with ease. But he had to try. Jack took a deep breath, trying to calm his racing heart. He thought of his family, his friends, all the people who would be worried sick about him by now. The thought gave him strength, a renewed determination to survive. "Okay," he said, his voice steady despite his fear. "It's now or never." Just as Jack was about to slip into the water, a new sound cut through the night. It was faint at first, but growing louder by the second. A rhythmic thumping that sent hope surging through his battered body. "A helicopter," Jack breathed, hardly daring to believe it. He fumbled in his pocket for the signal mirror, his hands shaking with a mixture of exhaustion and excitement. As the sound of the helicopter grew closer, Jack held up the mirror, angling it to catch the moonlight. "Here, I'm here," he shouted, his voice cracking with the effort. The orcas, agitated by the noise, began to vocalize loudly, their calls echoing across the water. Jack feared their activity might drive the helicopter away, but then he saw it, a beam of light cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the waves. "Please," Jack whispered, tears streaming down his face. "Please see me." The light swept past his position once, twice. On the third pass, it stopped, focusing directly on Jack's small island of stone. The helicopter was close enough now that Jack could feel the downdraft from its rotors, the wind whipping at his tattered clothes. As the aircraft hovered overhead, Jack saw a figure lean out, gesturing to him. A rescue basket was being lowered, swaying slightly in the wind. "I'm saved," Jack said, the words barely audible over the roar of the helicopter and the increasingly agitated calls of the orcas. With the last of his strength, Jack pulled himself into the rescue basket. As it began to rise, lifting him away from the rocks and the circling predators below, he looked down. The orcas were breaching, their massive bodies clearing the water as if in one final attempt to reach their elusive prey. "Better luck next time," Jack murmured, a mixture of relief and respect in his voice. As the helicopter banked away, carrying Jack to safety, he caught one last glimpse of the orcas. They were grouped together, their dorsal fins stark against the moonlit water. Their haunting calls followed him, a final farewell from these magnificent, terrifying creatures. Jack leaned back in the rescue basket, exhaustion finally overtaking him. He knew he had a long recovery ahead, both physical and psychological. But he had survived. Against all odds, he had faced off against nature's most intelligent predators and lived to tell the tale. As consciousness began to slip away, Jack's last thought was of the orcas. In their relentless pursuit, their coordinated attacks, he had witnessed something few humans ever would: the raw power and intelligence of these apex predators in their natural habitat. It was an experience he would never forget, and one that would forever change his perspective on the wild, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying world of nature. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter's rotors filled Jack's ears as he drifted in and out of consciousness. His body, pushed beyond its limits, was finally shutting down now that the immediate danger had passed. Fragments of memory flashed through his mind. The orcas' haunting calls, the bone-chilling cold of the Alaskan waters, the terror of being hunted. "Stay with us, sir," a voice cut through the haze. Jack forced his eyes open, meeting the concerned gaze of a Coast Guard rescue swimmer. "We're almost to Juneau. Just hang on a little longer." Jack tried to nod, but even that small movement sent waves of pain through his battered body. He settled for a weak grunt of acknowledgement. As the Yaito helicopter sped towards the mainland, Jack's thoughts drifted to the events that had led to his rescue. How long had he been stranded on that rock? How had they found him? The questions swirled in his mind, but he was too exhausted to voice them. Suddenly, a crackle of static filled the cabin, followed by an urgent voice over the radio. "Coast Guard Hilo 4, this is Juneau ATC. We have a situation developing near your current position. Multiple whale-watching boats reporting aggressive orca activity. They're requesting immediate assistance." The pilot's response was immediate. "Roger, that Juneau ATC. We're carrying a rescued kayaker in critical condition. Request alternate transport for medical evac so we can respond to the orca situation." Jack's heart rate spiked, adrenaline once again flooding his system. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that these were the same orcas that had hunted him. "No," he croaked, his voice barely audible over the noise of the helicopter. Don't go back." The rescue swimmer leaned in close. "What was that, sir?" Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Jack grabbed the man's arm. "The orcas, they're hunting. It's not normal behavior." The swimmer's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with concern. He turned to the pilot, relaying Jack's warning. For a moment, there was silence in the cabin as the crew weighed their options. Then the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Change of plans. We're continuing to Juneau with our current passenger. His condition is too critical to risk a transfer." Relief washed over Jack and he slumped back, his burst of energy depleted. As his eyes drifted closed, he heard the rescue swimmer radioing ahead for immediate medical attention upon landing. The next thing Jack knew, he was being rushed through the bright fluorescent lights of a hospital corridor. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him, calling out vital signs and medical jargon he couldn't comprehend. Severe hypothermia, multiple lacerations, possible internal injuries. The words floated above him as he was wheeled into an examination room. The last thing Jack saw before succumbing to unconsciousness was a doctor leaning over him, her face etched with concern. Hours later, Jack awoke to the steady beep of hospital monitors. His body felt heavy, weighed down by exhaustion and what he assumed were some powerful painkillers. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light of the hospital room, he became aware of a figure sitting by his bed. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Mr. Thornton," a gruff voice said. Jack turned his head to see a man in a Coast Guard uniform watching him intently. How long was I out?" Jack managed to rasp, his throat still raw from dehydration and exposure. "About 18 hours, the man replied. "I'm Commander Reeves, head of the local Coast Guard station. You gave us quite a scare out there." Jack attempted to sit up, but a sharp pain in his ribs forced him back down. Commander Reeves stood, adjusting Jack's bed to a more upright position. "Easy there," he cautioned. "You've got some healing to do before you're back on your feet." As Jack's head cleared, the events of the past few days came rushing back. The orcas, the desperate struggle for survival, the narrow escape. And then, the whale-watching boats, Jack said suddenly, his eyes widening. Is everyone okay?" Commander Reeves' expression grew serious. "That's actually why I'm here, Mr. Thornton. We need to talk about what happened out there." Over the next hour, Jack recounted his harrowing experience in as much detail as he could muster. He described the orcas' initial curiosity, their coordinated attacks, and the relentless pursuit that had nearly cost him his life. Commander Reeves listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "This behavior," the commander said when Jack had finished, "it's highly unusual. Orcas are known to be curious about boats and kayaks, but sustained aggressive behavior like this, it's almost unheard of." Jack nodded wearily. "I've been kayaking these waters for years. I've seen orcas before, but never anything like this. It was like they were hunting me." Commander Reeves leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Thornton, after we received your warning, we advised the whale-watching boats to leave the area immediately. Most complied, but one boat lingered. Too long." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "What happened?" "The orcas attacked the boat," Reeves said quietly, "rammed it repeatedly, punched a hole in the hull. If our rescue team hadn't arrived when they did," he trailed off, leaving the grim implication hanging in the air. "My God," Jack whispered, the full weight of the situation settling over him. "Were there any casualties?" Commander Reeves shook his head. "Thankfully, no. A few injuries from the impact, but nothing life-threatening. But it was a close call. Too close." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. A woman in a lab coat entered, her eyes moving from Commander Reeves to Jack. "I'm Dr. Simmons," she introduced herself. "I've been overseeing your care, Mr. Thornton. How are you feeling?" "Like I went 10 rounds with a killer whale," Jack replied, attempting a weak smile. Dr. Simmons didn't return the smile. Instead, she turned to Commander Reeves. "I need to examine my patient. Perhaps we could continue this discussion later?" The commander nodded, standing to leave. "Of course. Mr. Thornton, we'll talk more once you've had some rest. There are some marine biologists who are very interested in hearing your account of what happened." As Commander Reeves left the room, Dr. Simmons began her examination. She checked Jack's vitals, examined his wounds, and asked a series of questions about his pain levels and any symptoms he was experiencing. "You're lucky to be alive," she said as she finished up. "Another few hours out there, and we might be having a very different conversation." Jack nodded solemnly. "Believe me, I know. I really thought that was it for me out there." Dr. Simmons paused, her expression softening. "Mr. Thornton, I know Commander Reeves was asking you about what happened, but I want you to know that there are resources available if you need to talk to someone. An experience like this can leave scars that aren't visible." Jack felt a lump form in his throat. Up until now, he'd been running on adrenaline and focusing on the physical aspects of his ordeal. But now, in the quiet of the hospital room, the emotional weight of what he'd been through began to settle over him. "Thank you," he managed to say. I might take you up on that." Dr. Simmons nodded sympathetically. "Get some rest now. Your body needs time to heal." As she left the room, Jack leaned back against his pillows, his mind racing. The relief of rescue was now mingling with a growing unease. The orca's behavior was more than just unusual. It was potentially dangerous. And if they were still out there, still exhibiting this aggressive behavior. His thoughts were interrupted by another knock at the door. This time, a young woman entered, her eyes lighting up as she saw Jack awake. "Mr. Thornton, I'm Sarah Conley from the Juneau Marine Life Center. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions about your encounter with the orcas." Jack sighed, fatigue washing over him. "I've already gone over everything with Commander Reeves. Is this really necessary right now?" Sarah's enthusiasm dimmed slightly, but she pressed on. "I understand you're tired, Mr. Thornton, but this is crucial. The behavior you witnessed, it could indicate a significant shift in orca behavior in this region. Your account could be vital in understanding what's happening and potentially preventing future incidents." Despite his exhaustion, Jack found himself intrigued. "What do you mean? A shift in behavior?" Sarah pulled up a chair, her expression a mix of excitement and concern. "We've been tracking this particular pod of orcas for years. They've always been curious about boats, sometimes playful even. But this level of aggression? It's unprecedented." She pulled out a tablet, showing Jack a map of the Alaskan coastline dotted with markers. "In the past month, we've had a 200% increase in reported close encounters between orcas and vessels. Most have been benign, but a few..." She trailed, off swiping to a photo that made Jack's breath catch in his throat. It showed a small fishing boat with a massive dent in its hull, clearly the result of a powerful impact. "This was 2 weeks ago," Sarah explained. "The fisherman said an orca rammed his boat repeatedly. He barely made it back to port." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. "It's not just me, then. They're really changing." Sarah nodded gravely. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Is it a localized phenomenon? A reaction to changes in their environment? Or is it..." She hesitated. "Is it what?" Jack prompted. "Is it the beginning of a larger shift in orca behavior globally?" Sarah finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The implications of her words hung heavy in the air. Jack thought, back to his terrifying ordeal. The intelligence he'd seen in the orca's eyes, the coordinated nature of their attacks. It hadn't felt random or isolated. It had felt deliberate. "I'll tell you everything I can remember," Jack said finally, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. "If it can help prevent someone else from going through what I did, what those people on the whale-watching boat almost went through, then it's worth it." Sarah's face lit up with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Your account could be invaluable." As Sarah began to set up her recording equipment, Jack gazed out the window at the distant Alaskan waters. Somewhere out there, the orcas were still swimming, still hunting, and now, armed with the knowledge that his experience wasn't an isolated incident, Jack felt a new weight settling onto his shoulders. He had survived his encounter, but the story was far from over. Whatever was happening with the orcas, whatever was causing this shift in their behavior, Jack realized he was now inexorably linked to it. His ordeal had thrust him into the center of a mystery that could have far-reaching consequences for the relationship between humans and one of the ocean's most intelligent predators. As he began to recount his story once more, Jack knew that his life had been forever changed by those harrowing days on the water. The physical scars would heal, but the memory of those intelligent eyes, that relentless pursuit, would stay with him forever, and with it, a newfound respect and fear for the raw power of nature, and the realization that there was still so much about the ocean's apex predators that humans had yet to understand. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room cast long shadows as Jack Thornton sat upright in his bed, his eyes fixed on the television mounted on the wall. The local news was on, and the anchor's voice filled the room with a gravity that made Jack's stomach churn. In a startling development, authorities have closed several popular beaches along the Alaskan coastline, following a series of unusual orca encounters. The decision comes in the wake of the dramatic rescue of local kayaker Jack Thornton, who spent nearly 3 days stranded at sea while being stalked by a pod of aggressive orcas. Jack winced as grainy footage of his rescue appeared on the screen. He could barely recognize himself, a haggard, barely conscious figure being lifted into a Coast Guard helicopter. A soft knock at the door pulled Jack's attention away from the broadcast. Dr. Simmons entered, a clipboard in hand and a concerned look on her face. "How are we feeling today, Mr. Thornton?" she asked, moving to check his vitals. Jack managed a weak smile. "Better, I think. Still sore all over, but I'm starting to feel human again. Dr. Simmons nodded, making a note on her clipboard. That's good to hear. Your recovery is progressing well, all things considered. However, she paused, her expression growing serious. I'm a bit concerned about your mental state. Have you been experiencing any nightmares? Flashbacks? Jack's smile faded. He thought about the dreams that had plagued him over the past few nights. Vivid recreations of his ordeal, the feeling of being hunted, the terror of nearly drowning. He'd woken up more than once in a cold sweat, the phantom sound of ORCA calls echoing in his ears. Yeah, he admitted quietly. It's been rough. Dr. Simmons placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. That's entirely normal, given what you've been through. I'd like to arrange for you to speak with one of our trauma counselors. Would that be all right? Jack nodded, grateful for the suggestion. As much as he tried to put on a brave face, he knew he was struggling to process everything that had happened. As Dr. Simmons made a note in his chart, another knock came at the door. This time it was Sarah Conley from the Marine Life Center, accompanied by a tall, bearded man Jack didn't recognize. Mr. Thornton, Sarah said, her voice filled with barely contained excitement. I hope we're not interrupting. This is Dr. Marcus Reeves, our lead marine biologist. He's been analyzing the data from your encounter, and we've made some fascinating discoveries. Dr. Simmons shot the newcomers a disapproving look. My patient needs rest, not more interrogations. It's okay, Jack interjected, his curiosity piqued despite his fatigue. I'd like to hear what they've found. Dr. Simmons reluctantly nodded. All right, but keep it brief. Mr. Thornton still has a lot of recovering to do. As Dr. Simmons left the room, Dr. Reeves stepped forward, shaking Jack's hand firmly. Mr. Thornton, it's an honor to meet you. Your account of the ORCA behavior is unprecedented in our field. Jack shifted uncomfortably under the scientist's intense gaze. I'm not sure honor is the right word. I still have nightmares about those orcas. Dr. Reeves nodded sympathetically. Of course, and I apologize for my insensitivity. What you went through was traumatic, but the information you've provided could be crucial in understanding this shift in ORCA behavior. Sarah pulled up a chair, her tablet in hand. We've been correlating your account with other recent ORCA encounters and environmental data. Dr. Reeves, would you like to explain what we've found? The bearded scientist cleared his throat. Yes, well, it appears that the aggressive behavior you experienced is not an isolated incident. We've seen a marked increase in similar encounters along the Alaskan coast over the past few months. He paused, pulling out his own tablet and bringing up a map dotted with red markers. Each of these points represents a reported aggressive ORCA encounter. As you can see, they're concentrated in this region, but we're starting to see similar reports coming in from other parts of the world. Jack leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement. But why? What's causing this? Dr. Reeves stroked his beard thoughtfully. That's the million-dollar question, Mr. Thornton. We have several theories, but nothing conclusive yet. One possibility is that changes in their food supply are driving the orcas to explore new hunting strategies. Sarah chimed in, her voice filled with concern. We've also been monitoring unusual changes in ocean temperatures and acidity levels in the region. It's possible these environmental factors are influencing ORCA behavior in ways we don't yet understand. Jack absorbed this information, his mind racing. So what you're saying is, this could get worse? Dr. Reeves nodded gravely. It's a possibility we have to consider, which is why your account is so valuable. The level of coordination and persistence you described in their hunting behavior, it's unlike anything we've seen before. As if on cue, the television in the room switched to breaking news. The anchor's voice cut through the room, tension evident in her tone. We're receiving reports of another ORCA incident off the coast of Juneau. A small fishing vessel has reportedly been attacked by a pod of orcas, leaving 2 fishermen injured. Coast Guard rescue operations are underway. The room fell silent as they all turned to watch the unfolding news story. Grainy footage showed a fishing boat limping into port, its hull visibly damaged. Jack felt a chill run down his spine. It's happening again, he murmured. Dr. Reeves turned back to Jack, his expression intense. Mr. Thornton, I know you're still recovering, But we need your help. Your first-hand experience could be crucial in developing strategies to mitigate these encounters. Jack hesitated, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He thought about his ordeal, the terror he'd experienced, the nightmares that still plagued him, but he also thought about the fishermen, the whale-watching boats, all the people who could be at risk if this behavior continued to escalate. "What do you need me to do?" he asked finally, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. Sarah's face lit up with relief. "We're assembling a task force to study this phenomenon and develop safety protocols. Your insights would be invaluable." Dr. Reeves nodded in agreement. "Once you're cleared medically, of course, we wouldn't want to jeopardize your recovery." Jack took a deep breath, wincing slightly at the pain in his ribs. "Okay," he said, his voice quiet but determined. "I'm in." Over the next few weeks, Jack's recovery progressed steadily. Physical therapy helped him regain his strength, while sessions with a trauma counselor gave him tools to cope with the psychological aftermath of his ordeal. But even as his body healed, his mind remained focused on the mystery of the orca's behavior. Finally, the day came when Dr. Simmons declared Jack fit to leave the hospital. As he packed up his few belongings, a knock came at the door. It was Commander Reeves from the Coast Guard. "Mr. Thornton," the commander said, his tone formal. "I hope I'm not intruding." Jack shook his head. "Not at all, Commander. What can I do for you?" Reeves stepped into the room, his posture stiff. "I wanted to update you on the situation personally. Since your rescue, we've had 6 more reported ORCA attacks on vessels in the region, 2 resulting in injuries, thankfully none fatal." Jack felt his heart rate quicken. "My God, has there been any progress in understanding why this is happening?" The commander's expression darkened. "That's actually why I'm here. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration has officially classified this as an unusual mortality event for both orcas and humans. They're sending in a team of experts and they've requested your participation in the investigation." Jack blinked in surprise. "Me? But I'm not a scientist or a marine expert." "No," Reeves agreed. "But you're the only person who's had prolonged, close contact with these orcas and survived to tell about it. Your observations could be crucial." Jack sat heavily on the edge of the hospital bed, the weight of the situation settling over him. "When do they need me?" "As soon as you're ready," Reeves replied. "I understand if you need more time to recover, but—" "No," Jack interrupted, a steely resolve forming in his eyes. "No more time. If I can help prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else, I want to start right away." Commander Reeves nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "Very well. I'll make the arrangements. The team will want to take you back out on the water to the site of your encounter. Are you prepared for that?" Jack felt a flutter of fear in his stomach at the thought of returning to the scene of his ordeal. But he pushed it down, focusing instead on the importance of the mission. "I'll be ready," he said firmly. The next morning found Jack aboard a Coast Guard cutter, cutting through the choppy Alaskan waters. The sky was overcast, a light drizzle adding to the gloomy atmosphere. Jack stood at the rail, his eyes scanning the horizon, a mixture of anticipation and dread churning in his gut. Dr. Reeves approached, handing Jack a steaming mug of coffee. "How are you holding up?" Jack accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping his hands around its warmth. "Honestly, I'm terrified. But I know this is important." The marine biologist nodded sympathetically. "Your courage is admirable, Mr. Thornton. Many would have walked away after what you experienced." Their conversation was interrupted by a shout from the bow. "Orcas spotted, 2 o'clock. Jack's heart leapt into his throat as he rushed to the railing. Sure enough, several tall dorsal fins were cutting through the water about 100 yards out. As he watched, one of the orcas breached, its massive body hanging in the air for a moment before crashing back into the sea. "My God," Jack breathed, memories of his ordeal flooding back. "It's them. I'm sure of it." Dr. Reeves was instantly alert, pulling out a camera with a long-range lens. "Can you describe what you're seeing, Mr. Thornton? Any behaviors that seem familiar or unusual?" Jack forced himself to focus, pushing down the fear threatening to overwhelm him. They're moving differently than before. More agitated. And the vocalizations." He trailed off, listening intently to the haunting, calls carrying across the water. What about them? Dr. Reeves prompted, his pen poised over a notepad. They're different, Jack said slowly, struggling to articulate what he was hearing. During my encounter, their calls were, I don't know, more coordinated. Now they sound almost frantic. As if to underscore his point, one of the orcas suddenly charged towards the boat, veering off at the last moment. The crew members shouted in alarm, and the captain's voice came over the intercom ordering everyone inside. But Jack remained rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the circling predators. One of the orcas, a large male with a distinctive notch in its dorsal fin, surfaced near the boat. For a heart-stopping moment, Jack found himself staring directly into its eye. It's him, Jack whispered, recognition dawning. The one that led the attack on my kayak. Dr. Reeves was furiously taking notes. Are you sure? Can you describe any identifying features? But Jack was no longer listening. He was lost in the orca's gaze, a mix of intelligence and something else. Something almost like recognition. The moment stretched on, man and predator locked in a silent communion that transcended species. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the orca dove, its massive body disappearing beneath the waves. The rest of the pod followed suit, leaving the surface eerily calm. Jack released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to Dr. Reeves, his face pale, but his eyes blazing with a newfound determination. We need to understand them, he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Not just their behavior, but their motivations. There's something going on here that's bigger than anything we've seen before. Dr. Reeves nodded solemnly. I agree. And I think you might be the key to unlocking this mystery, Mr. Thornton. As the Coast Guard cutter turned back towards port, Jack remained at the railing, his eyes fixed on the spot where the orcas had disappeared. He knew that his ordeal wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But for the first time since his rescue, he felt a sense of purpose cutting through the fear and uncertainty. Whatever was happening with the orcas, whatever was driving this change in their behavior, Jack was determined to see it through. Not just for his own peace of mind, but for the safety of everyone who ventured into these waters, and for the orcas themselves. As the Alaskan coastline came into view, Jack made a silent promise to himself and to the intelligent predators that had nearly claimed his life. He would unravel this mystery, no matter the cost. The encounter that had almost killed him had also given him a unique perspective, a connection to these magnificent creatures that no one else possessed. It was time to turn that harrowing experience into something positive, to bridge the gap between two species that suddenly found themselves at odds. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with dangers both physical and emotional, but Jack Thornton was ready to face it head-on, driven by a mix of fear, respect, and an unshakable determination to understand the orcas that had changed his life forever. The Juneau Marine Life Center bustled with activity as Jack Thornton made his way through the crowded hallways. It had been 6 weeks since his harrowing encounter with the orcas, and though his physical wounds had largely healed, the psychological scars remained raw and tender. Each step through the facility brought a mix of determination and anxiety, his mind constantly replaying the terrifying moments of his ordeal. As he approached the conference room where the task force was meeting, Jack paused, taking a deep breath to steady himself. The nightmares had become less frequent, but the lingering fear remained a constant companion. He reached for the door handle, his hand trembling slightly. "You've got this, Jack," he muttered to himself, squaring his shoulders before entering the room. The buzz of conversation died down as Jack stepped inside. Around a large oval table sat an assembly of scientists, marine biologists, and government officials, all turning to regard the man who had become the unwitting center of their investigation. Dr. Marcus Reeves stood to greet him, a warm smile on his bearded face. "Mr. Thornton, thank you for joining us. Please have a seat." Jack nodded, making his way to an empty chair. As he sat, he couldn't help but notice the mixture of curiosity and concern in the eyes of those around him. He was no longer just Jack Thornton, experienced kayaker. He was now a living case study, a survivor with unique insights into the very phenomenon they were struggling to understand. Commander Reeves from the Coast Guard cleared his throat, calling the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, as you're All aware, the situation with the orcas has continued to escalate. In the past month alone, we've had 12 reported incidents of aggressive orca behavior towards vessels, 3 of which resulted in injuries to crew members. A murmur of concern rippled through the room. Jack felt his heart rate quicken, memories of his own encounter flashing unbidden through his mind. Dr. Sarah Conley, the young marine biologist who had first interviewed Jack in the hospital, spoke up. We've been analyzing the data from these encounters as well as environmental factors in the region. There are some patterns emerging, but we're still far from understanding the root cause of this behavioral shift. What about the theory of changes in their food supply? Jack found himself asking, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. Dr. Reeves nodded approvingly. An excellent question, Mr. Thornton. We've been monitoring fish populations in the area, and while there have been some fluctuations, nothing significant enough to explain such a dramatic change in orca behavior. Could it be related to pollution? Another scientist chimed in. Perhaps some kind of toxin in the water affecting their neurological functions? The discussion continued, theories flying back and forth across the table. Jack listened intently, trying to reconcile the scientific jargon with his own visceral experience. As the debate wore on, he found his mind wandering back to that moment on the Coast Guard cutter, when he had locked eyes with the large male orca, the same one that had led the attack on his kayak. There was something in its eyes, Jack said suddenly, his voice cutting through the ongoing discussion. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Mr. Thornton? Dr. Reeves prompted gently. Jack swallowed hard, struggling to find the right words. When I saw that orca again from the Coast Guard boat, there was recognition in its eyes, not just intelligence, but awareness. Like it knew me, remembered me. A skeptical murmur ran through the room, but Dr. Conley leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. Can you elaborate on that, Jack? What exactly did you perceive in that moment? Jack closed his eyes, trying to recapture the intensity of that encounter. It was more than just a predator looking at prey. There was curiosity there and something else, almost like it was trying to communicate something. Anthropomorphization, one of the other scientists scoffed. We can't project human emotions onto these animals, no matter how intelligent they may be. With all due respect, Jack countered, a hint of steel entering his voice. I spent 3 days being hunted by these orcas. I saw their coordination, their problem-solving abilities. There's more going on here than just animal instinct. Commander Reeves held up a hand, silencing the growing debate. Mr. Thornton's insights are precisely why he's here. We need to consider all possibilities, even those that challenge our preconceptions. Dr. Reeves stroked his beard thoughtfully. Jack, you mentioned coordination and problem-solving. Can you give us specific examples from your encounter? Jack nodded, taking a deep breath as he prepared to relive the most terrifying moments of his life. They worked in tandem, always. When one would break off from an attack, another would seamlessly take its place. They used different strategies, ramming my kayak, trying to capsize it, even attempting to create waves to wash me off the rocks when I found refuge. He paused, the memory causing a shiver to run down his spine. But the most unnerving part was how they seemed to learn and adapt. Each attack was more sophisticated than the last. It was like they were experimenting, figuring out the best way to get to me. The room was silent as the implications of Jack's words sank in. It was Dr. Conley who finally broke the silence. If what you're describing is accurate, it suggests a level of cognitive function and social learning far beyond what we've previously documented in orca populations. Or, the skeptical scientist interjected, it could simply be a stress response to environmental factors we haven't yet identified. We need to be careful about jumping to conclusions based on one man's subjective experience. Jack felt a flash of anger at the dismissal, but before he could respond, an aide burst into the room, her face pale with urgency. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said breathlessly, but there's been another incident. A tour boat was attacked by a pod of orcas just off the coast. They're saying it's bad. The room erupted into a flurry of activity. Commander Reeves was immediately on his phone coordinating with Coast Guard units. Dr. Reeves turned to Jack, his eyes grave. Mr. Thornton, I know this is asking a lot, but would you be willing to accompany a research team to the site? Your insights could be crucial in understanding what's happening and potentially preventing further incidents. Jack felt a cold knot of fear form in his stomach. The thought of going back out on the water, of potentially facing the orcas again, sent a wave of panic through him. But as he looked around at the concerned faces of the scientists and officials, he knew he couldn't refuse. "I'll go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Within the hour, Jack found himself aboard a Coast Guard vessel speeding towards the site of the latest attack. The sky was overcast, a light drizzle adding to the ominous atmosphere. Dr. Conley stood beside him at the rail, her equipment ready to document any ORCA activity they might encounter. "Are you okay, Jack?" she asked, noticing his tense posture and tight grip on the railing. He managed a weak smile. "Ask me again when this is over." As they neared the coordinates of the attack, Jack's eyes scanned the choppy waters, every white cap and shadow causing his heart to race. Then he saw it, a dorsal fin cutting through the waves about 100 yards off the port bow. "There," he shouted, pointing. The crew sprang into action, cameras and hydrophones deployed to capture any data they could. Jack watched, a mix of fear and fascination gripping him as more fins appeared. He counted at least 6 orcas, moving in a coordinated pattern that was all too familiar. "They're hunting," he said, his voice tight with tension. Dr. Conley looked at him sharply. "How can you tell?" "It's the same formation they used when they were after me," Jack explained, his eyes never leaving the water. "See how they're spread out, but always maintaining visual contact with each other? They're herding something." As if on cue, a smaller boat came into view, the tour vessel that had been attacked. It was listing badly to one side, a gaping hole visible in its hull. Coast Guard personnel were already on board, tending to the injured and preparing to tow the damaged craft back to port. Suddenly, one of the orcas broke from the group, heading straight for the rescue operation. Jack felt his breath catch in, his throat as he recognized the distinctive notch in its dorsal fin. "It's him," he whispered. "The one that led the attack on me." The orca's approach sent the Coast Guard crew into a frenzy, shouting warnings and preparing to defend the damaged vessel. But at the last moment, the massive creature veered off, swimming in a tight circle around the boats before rejoining. "Its pod. What was that about?" Dr. Conley wondered aloud, furiously taking notes. Jack shook his head, bewildered. "I don't know. It almost seemed like he was checking on them, making sure they were really leaving." As the rescue operation continued, Jack and Dr. Conley observed the orca's behavior, noting every movement and vocalization. The pod remained in the area, always visible but maintaining a distance that seemed calculated to be just on the edge of threatening. Hours passed, the tension never fully dissipating. As the damaged tour boat was finally secured and the rescue vessels prepared to head back to port, Jack noticed a change in the orca's behavior. "They're leaving," he said, pointing to where the pod was now moving away from the area, their dorsal fins disappearing beneath the waves. Dr. Conley frowned, reviewing her notes. "But why now? What changed?" Jack stared out at the now empty sea, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool Alaskan air. "They accomplished what they came for," he said quietly. Whatever that was. The journey back to Juneau was subdued, the weight of the day's events hanging heavily over everyone. Jack sat in silence, trying to process everything he had seen. The orca's behavior continued to defy easy explanation, leaving him with more questions than answers. As they docked, Commander Reeves approached Jack and Dr. Conley. "We're convening an emergency meeting to discuss today's incident. Your presence is requested, Mr. Thornton." Jack nodded wearily. "Of course, I'll be there." The conference room was packed when Jack arrived, the air thick with tension and speculation. He took a seat next to Dr. Conley, grateful for her reassuring presence amidst the sea of unfamiliar faces. Commander Reeves called the meeting to order, his face grim. "Ladies and gentlemen, today's incident has forced us to recognize that we are dealing with a crisis that is rapidly spiraling out of control. The tour boat attack today had 17 passengers on board, 3 of whom are now in critical condition." A collective gasp went through the room. Jack felt his heart sink, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "We need solutions," the commander continued, "and we need them now. Dr. Reeves, what can you tell us about the orca's behavior during this latest attack?" The marine biologist stood, his usual scholarly calm replaced by a palpable sense of urgency. "Based on the observations made by Mr. Thornton and Dr. Conley, as well as footage captured during the incident, we're seeing a level of coordination and intentionality in these attacks that is unprecedented." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "To put it bluntly, these orcas are not simply reacting to environmental stressors or changes in their food supply. They appear to be actively and deliberately targeting human vessels." The room erupted into a cacophony of voices, theories, and arguments flying back and forth. Jack sat silently, his mind racing. He thought back to that moment of eye contact with the lead orca, the sense of recognition and something else, something he still couldn't quite define. "Mr. Thornton," Commander Reeves's voice cut through the din, "you've had more direct contact with these orcas than anyone. What's your assessment of the situation?" All eyes turned to Jack. He swallowed hard, gathering his thoughts. I think we're missing something fundamental here. These aren't just random attacks. There's a purpose behind them, a driving force we haven't identified yet." "Are you suggesting these animals have some kind of agenda?" a skeptical voice called out. Jack shook his head. "I'm not sure I'd go that far, but I do believe they're responding to something that's changed in their environment, in their world. And until we figure out what that is, we're just treating symptoms, not the cause." Dr. Conley spoke up, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. What if we're looking at this all wrong? We keep trying to understand the orca's behavior through our own lens, our human perspective. But what if the key is to try and see the world through their eyes?" A murmur ran through the room, a mixture of intrigue and skepticism. Dr. Reeves leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What are you proposing, Dr. Conley?" She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for the reaction her words might provoke. "I think we need to establish direct communication with the orcas." The room exploded into a cacophony of voices, some expressing excitement at the idea, others dismissing it as pure fantasy. Commander Reeves had to shout to restore order. "Dr. Conley," he said, his voice stern but not unkind, "while I appreciate your innovative thinking, how exactly do you propose we communicate with a species that doesn't share our language?" Sarah stood her ground, her eyes blazing with determination. "Orcas are highly intelligent and social creatures with complex communication systems of their own. We've made significant strides in understanding their vocalizations. With the right technology and approach, I believe we can establish a basic form of communication." Jack found himself nodding along, memories of his encounter flooding back. "She's right," he said, surprised by the conviction in his voice. "When I was out there, stranded on those rocks, I could sense them trying to communicate. Not just with each other, but with me. It was like they were trying to tell me something, but I couldn't understand." The skeptical scientist from earlier scoffed. "This is preposterous. We're talking about wild animals, not some science fiction scenario where we can simply strike up a conversation with another species." Dr. Reeves held up a hand, silencing the growing debate. "I think we owe it to ourselves, and to the orcas, to explore every possible avenue. Dr. Conley, what would you need to attempt this communication?" Sarah's face lit up with excitement. "We'd need to develop a more sophisticated hydrophone system, one capable of not just recording but also transmitting a wide range of frequencies. We'd also need to analyze hours of orca vocalizations, trying to identify patterns and potential meanings." She paused, her expression growing more serious. "But most importantly, we'd need someone who has had direct, prolonged contact with these specific orcas, someone they might recognize, someone who could act as a bridge between our species." All eyes in the room turned to Jack. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. "You want me to try and talk to them?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and hope. "You're our best chance, Jack. You've survived an encounter with them. You've looked into their eyes, sensed their intelligence. If anyone can make this connection, it's you." Jack felt the room spinning around him. The thought of deliberately, Putting himself in proximity to the orcas again sent a wave of panic through his system. But beneath the fear there was something else. A burning curiosity. A need to understand what had really happened out there on those frigid Alaskan waters. Commander Reeves leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mr. Thornton, I want to be clear that no one is going to force you to do this. What Dr. Conley is proposing is dangerous and unprecedented. If you choose to participate, it would be entirely voluntary." Jack closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He thought about the terror of his ordeal, the nightmares that still plagued him, but he also thought about the moment of connection he had felt with the lead orca. That flash of mutual recognition that had left him shaken and intrigued. When he opened his eyes, there was a steely resolve in his gaze. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "If there's even a chance we can understand what's driving their behavior, maybe prevent more attacks, I have to try." The room fell silent, the weight of Jack's decision hanging in the air. Dr. Reeves was the first to speak, his voice filled with admiration and concern. "Thank you, Mr. Thornton. Your courage is commendable. We'll take every precaution to ensure your safety during this experiment." As the meeting adjourned and plans began to take shape, Jack found himself standing by the window, looking out over the choppy Alaskan waters. Sarah approached, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Are you sure about this, Jack?" she asked softly. "No one would think less of you if you changed your mind." Jack turned to face her, his expression a mixture of fear and determination. "I'm terrified," he admitted, "but I can't shake the feeling that I'm meant to do this, those orcas. They could have killed me, Sarah, but they didn't. There's something more going on here, and I need to understand what it is." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "We'll be with you every step of the way, and at the first sign of danger, we'll pull you out, I promise." Over the next few weeks, preparations for the unprecedented communication attempt moved forward at a feverish pace. Jack split his time between intensive training sessions with marine biologists and grueling therapy sessions to help him cope with the lingering trauma of his ordeal. Dr. Reeves oversaw the development of a specialized underwater communication system, complete with high-fidelity hydrophones and a complex array of speakers capable of reproducing the full range of orca vocalizations. Sarah worked tirelessly, analyzing hundreds of hours of recorded orca calls, trying to decipher patterns and potential meanings. As the day of the experiment approached, Jack found his anxiety rising to nearly unbearable levels. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, leaving him sweating and shaking in the early hours of the morning. But with each passing day, his resolve strengthened. He was driven by a mixture of fear, curiosity, and an inexplicable sense of connection to the very creatures that had nearly taken his life. Finally, the day arrived. Jack stood on the deck of a research vessel, staring out at the fog-shrouded waters where, just months ago, he had fought for his survival. He was clad in a specially designed wetsuit, equipped with underwater cameras and the prototype communication device. Dr. Reeves approached, his face etched with concern. "Jack, I want to remind you one last time. You don't have to do this. We can find another way." Jack managed a weak smile. "I appreciate that, Doc. But we both know I'm our best shot at making this work." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Besides, I need to do this, for myself as much as for the research." The older man nodded, clapping Jack on the shoulder. "You're a brave man, Jack Thornton. We'll be monitoring everything from here. At the first sign of trouble, you'll pull me out," Jack finished. "I know. Let's do this before I lose my nerve." With a final nod to the assembled team, Jack lowered himself into the chilly Alaskan waters. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly transporting him back to those terrifying days stranded at sea. He forced himself to take slow, steady breaths, focusing on the task at hand. Sarah's voice crackled through his earpiece. "We're picking up orca vocalizations about half a mile to the east, Jack. Are you ready to begin?" "As I'll ever be," Jack replied, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. He began to swim in the direction Sarah had indicated, every splash and ripple in the water sending his heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only 15 minutes, Jack saw them, a pod of orcas, their distinctive black and white forms gliding effortlessly through the water about 100 yards away. He froze, treading water as the magnificent and terrifying creatures drew closer. "They've spotted you, Jack." Sarah's voice came through, tense with anticipation. "Remember the sequences we practiced. Start with the greeting call." With shaking hands, Jack activated the communication device. A series of clicks and whistles emanated from the speakers, an approximation of an ORCA greeting based on Sarah's research. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, to Jack's amazement, one of the orcas responded with a nearly identical call. "It's working," he breathed, scarcely able to believe it. Over the next hour, Jack remained in the water, exchanging a series of calls with the orcas. They seemed curious, circling him at a distance but never approaching too closely. Jack found his fear slowly giving way to awe as he watched the graceful creatures, their intelligence evident in every movement. Then he saw him, the large male, with the notched dorsal fin, the one that had led the attack on his kayak, the one he had locked eyes with from the Coast Guard cutter. The orca broke away from the pod, swimming directly towards Jack with purposeful speed. "Jack, get out of there now!" Dr. Reeves's panicked voice came through the earpiece, but Jack remained where he was, his heart pounding, but his gaze steady, as the massive creature approached. The orca slowed as it neared, rising partially out of the water until its eye was level with Jack's. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Man and whale regarded each other. Jack saw in that intelligent gaze not aggression or hunger, but something he could only describe as recognition and an almost sorrowful understanding. Acting on instinct, Jack reached out a trembling hand. The orca remained still, allowing Jack's fingers to barely graze its smooth skin. A jolt seemed to pass between them, a connection that transcended species. In that moment, Jack understood. The orca's aggression, their attacks on boats and humans, it wasn't random or driven by simple hunger. It was a response, a desperate attempt to communicate something of vital importance. "They're trying to tell us something," Jack said, his voice filled with wonder and dawning comprehension. "Something's wrong in their world, and they need our help." As if in confirmation, the orca let out a long, mournful call unlike anything Jack had heard before. It reverberated through the water, filled with a sadness and urgency that needed no translation. Slowly, the orca backed away, rejoining its pod. They circled Jack one last time before disappearing into the depths, leaving him floating in the suddenly empty sea, forever changed by the encounter. As the research team pulled Jack from the water, a buzz of excitement and confusion filled the air. The data they had collected, the interactions they had witnessed, it would take months, maybe years to fully analyze and understand. But one thing was clear. A bridge had been built, a first tentative step towards communication between two intelligent species. In the days and weeks that followed, Jack found the lingering fear from his ordeal slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose. The nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of deep dark waters filled not with terror but with possibility. As he stood on the shore watching the sun set over the Alaskan waters where his incredible journey had begun, Jack felt a profound sense of peace. The orcas were still out there, still a powerful and potentially dangerous presence. But now they were no longer just predators to be feared. They were fellow inhabitants of a shared planet, with their own complex lives, societies, and challenges. Jack knew that his work was far from over. Understanding the orca's message, addressing whatever was driving their behavior, it would be the work of years, maybe a lifetime. But as he watched the last rays of sunlight dance across the waves, he felt ready to face that challenge. For, in that moment of connection eye to eye with one of the ocean's greatest predators, Jack Thornton had found not just understanding, but a new purpose. He had become a bridge between two worlds, and in doing so, had finally conquered the lingering fears that had haunted him since his ordeal. As he turned to walk back towards the research center, Jack felt a sense of anticipation for what the future might hold. The mystery of the orca's behavior was far from solved, but the first steps had been taken on a journey of discovery that could change humanity's relationship with the ocean and its inhabitants forever. And Jack, once a victim of the sea's most intelligent predators, now found himself at the forefront of this incredible adventure. The lingering fears that had once threatened to consume him had become the very force driving him forward into a future filled with possibility and wonder.